Hello, my name is Orly Ben-Rashlight. I am an entrepreneur, women's achievement and empowerment, human rights defender, speaker, and mom. After 20 years of war, the Taliban is back. But questions are being asked about how the group will govern the country and what their rule means for women, human rights, and political freedoms. With me today is a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy and a member of the Eisenhower Media Network. In 2009, he resigned his position with the State Department in Afghanistan in protest of the escalation of the war. Prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, he took part in the American occupation of Iraq. When not deployed, he worked in Afghanistan and Iraq war and policy and operation issues at the Pentagon and State Department. Welcome, Matthew Hoh. Welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me with you, Orly.
Thank you. Matthew, there is evidence that since 2015, the Taliban forces were pre-positioned across Afghanistan, ready to begin offensive operations. Trump's administration signed a peace deal with the Taliban in February 2020. Didn't President Biden have to go through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban?
That's exactly right, Orly. That's exactly right. President Biden has said he only had two choices when he came into office: either honor the agreement or go back to the war, and an escalated war that would have seen a great amount of American casualties. And so that's exactly what happened. The Taliban, when I was in Afghanistan in 2009, it was obvious the Taliban were getting stronger and stronger every year. And they did. Every year, the Taliban got stronger. And you could just see that by the amount of influence they had. But more directly, you could see it by every year they put more roadside bombs on the ground. Every year they launched more rocket attacks. Every year they killed more. I mean, so it was very clear that the war was strengthening the Taliban. And as you said, it got to a point in 2015. That's a pretty good estimation of the time frame for where it occurs, where they then kind of have gotten so strong that they can now strategize on how they are going to win. And what you see is a very capable and effective strategy by the Taliban. Donald Trump comes into office in 2017. He had campaigned on ending the war, but we have to remember, for the first 2 years of his presidency, or the first year and a half of his presidency, he actually escalates the war. He goes along with the American generals and drops more bombs on Afghanistan than either Bush or Obama did. So he tries to win the war before he has to negotiate. And then I don't give Donald Trump much credit about this at all, because I think the negotiations were more about his ego and wanting to honor that political campaign promise about ending the war than anything else. But certainly, by the time even Trump is in that position, there really is not much for the United States to do, because the United States had chosen to win this war militarily. In 2009, when Barack Obama escalates the war, which is what I resigned over, the United States goes from having about 30,000 American troops in Afghanistan, along with about 30,000 foreign NATO troops and contractors, to by 2011 having, or really the summer of 2010, having 100,000 American troops, 40,000 NATO troops, 100,000 contractors, plus growing this Afghan military force, right? So the United States really tried to win militarily, refused to negotiate. This is the consequences.
Right. So you did say many times that U.S. Mistakes ran far, far deeper than poor last-minute planning, that the American media got everything wrong about what's been happening in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. They said things about the war, about how Afghanistan prior to the withdrawal was in a period of relative stability, how there has been progress. You say these are complete lies and fabrications that are very easy to fact check, but that they don't. So having a large number of people in a society who are misinformed is absolutely devastating and extremely difficult to cope with. I mean, we've seen that with the coronavirus, with China, with so many things. So why don't we do a fact check and start from the beginning?
Sure.
Back in 2001, when the US was responding to the 9/11 attack, officials identified Islamist militant group Al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden as responsible. Bin Laden was in Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban. When they refused to hand him over, the US intervened militarily, quickly removing the Taliban and vowing to support democracy and eliminate the terrorist threat. Is this a truth or a lie?
It's a narrative, I think, is the best way to describe it. It's a narrative. It's a set of statements that support the war, and there are elements of truth to it, and there's elements of lies to it, or falsity to it.
What's the truth?
The truth is that the United States was attacked by Al-Qaeda on 9/11, that they were in Afghanistan as a guest of the Taliban. It was an uneasy relationship between the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda. You can kind of think of it in a sense that you have a relative come live with you, and after they've overstayed their welcome, you can't really kick them out, but you're not happy they're there. You know, that's kind of a very simplistic way to describe that relationship. We do know that the American FBI looked very hard to find any evidence that the Taliban had any knowledge or involvement in the planning of the 9/11 attacks. There was none. I mean, there were members of Al-Qaeda who had no idea about the attacks. There's a famous video of bin Laden talking to his comrades, to his subordinates, you know, where he is telling them what is happening because they don't know what's happening. They're not even aware it was an Al-Qaeda attack on New York and on Washington, D.C. So you have things like that. And of course, the problem with the narrative as well is that narrative starts on 9/11. It doesn't include all the events that lead up to it, all the circumstances, all the causations, all the look, Al-Qaeda attackers, whether or not you agree with them or not, they listed grievances that are real grievances. Again, you don't have to agree with them, but you have to know if they are real. And the three main grievances they had, it was not the fact that they hate our freedoms or that our women dressed immodestly or, you know, any of the girls went to school or any of that. That was not it. Their grievances were primarily the United States was sanctioning Iraq and bombing Iraq. And we have to remember that at times, the United States was bombing Iraq in the 90s on a daily basis. We forget this, that it comes out as an average that the United States throughout the 90s was bombing Iraq 2 to 3 times a week, as well as the sanctions, which were murderous sanctions that caused enormous suffering, hundreds of thousands of deaths in Iraq. That was one grievance. The second grievance was, of which I think that's a very understandable grievance. The second grievance, I think, for most people, because this is a very thorny issue, I certainly have my views on Israel-Palestine, but wherever you stand on it, you could say that, okay, I could see why someone would say that U.S. support for Israel is something I am going to fight against. Whether you agree with it or not, it's a legitimate grievance, right? And then the third one is that the United States has troops in Saudi Arabia, in the Islamic Holy Land, right? That U.S. forces are occupying the holiest of places for Muslims. You know, so you can look at that and say, oh, okay, as well as the history of everything of the U.S. supporting despotic governments, supporting military regimes, supporting regimes that were mass human rights violators. Again, bombing, staging coups, invading, occupying, on and on and on. Those are the things that lead up to 9/11. So, right, I mean, I think we have to understand that. And then as well as, too, the issue of the Taliban not handing over bin Laden, they did offer. It wasn't a question of they never offered. They did offer to hand him over. They had preconditions. They want him to go to a third country or an Islamic country rather than directly to the United States. They needed proof. Well, the proof was there. Bin Laden pretty much said it himself. He did it. But the other part, too, is that certainly that third country most likely would have been Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis or the Pakistanis would have handed bin Laden over to us right away. But I mean, you certainly have statements from the American government, from President Bush, from Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld, in October, November, December, saying, we're not interested in talking, we're not interested in any surrender, we are interested in victory. And that type of victory mindset is what dominates the American occupation and dooms it for 20 years.
Okay, thank you. Another fact check. Most Afghans support the incredible work the Afghan government has done in the last 2 decades. Truth or a lie?
That's an absolute fabrication, a lie. I'll try and keep my language polite, just because I know so many Afghans who've suffered. Look, there have been pockets of Afghans who have benefited from the presence. I'm not even talking about the Afghans who have gotten wealthy, because there have been elements of Afghanistan, both expatriate and those living in Afghanistan, who could quite rightly be depicted as war profiteers. Nothing compared to the American war profiteers, just to make that clear. But there have have also been a large number of Afghans who have benefited from the American presence. They've been able to, particularly women, they've been able to work, they've been able to go to school, they've been able to travel. However, it's a relatively small percentage. 75% of Afghans live outside the cities, in the rural areas where the war has been occurring. For most Afghans, for the last 20 years, they have been more concerned with being killed by they or their family or friends being killed by a roadside bomb put in by the Taliban or a bomb dropped from the sky by the Americans than they are concerned with being able to go to school. Even in the places where the war was not being fought heavily. So say in the northern areas of Afghanistan, where parts of those areas where it was firmly under control of the Afghan government. Well, what that control meant was it was under the control of warlords who brutalized the people, who preyed upon the people. So even if the fighting was not there, you still have violence inflicted on you by a predatory government that was run by warlords. So, I mean, you had other things too. You had the fact that after 20 years of American occupation and doing all this good in Afghanistan, 90% of Afghans live on less than $2 a day. That's the poverty line in Afghanistan. 70% of Afghans live under $1 a day. So you're understanding that the vast majority of Afghans are living a subsistence existence. The World Food Program lists Afghanistan as the second most food insecure country in the world. I mean, this was before the Taliban takeover. The only industry in Afghanistan is the narcotics trade, is the drug trade.
It is Western intervention has resulted in Afghanistan becoming the world's first narco state.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess you can make an argument that Colombia and other Central American countries that are allied with the United States, right, are narco states. I mean, so this is a pattern, the complicity between the American government and mafia, gangsters, racketeers, whatever you want to call them, is something that goes back throughout American history. And this is something that the Americans inherit from the British. And of course, the British with the Opium Wars and, and how this is how the British got Hong Kong. Right. I mean, there's a lot of, there's a line that runs through history. And you can see this in terms of the involvement, in the human rights angle of Afghanistan. Of course, the Taliban were terrible. But the Taliban, this government was not much better. You see with, say, women's rights, which is rightly, people should be very concerned about women's rights. But under the Afghan government, 4 out of 5 women were forcibly married, many of them child brides. A man could legally rape his wife. And if a woman was raped, the rapist didn't go to jail. Her attacker didn't go to jail. She went to jail because she had committed a moral crime by being raped. That was the Afghan government. So not as theatrical as the Taliban, or maybe not as extreme, but certainly to claim that somehow the majority of people were enjoying a benefit of this occupation is simply not true. Again, yes, there were some, but that some is a small percentage of the whole, and the suffering that occurred from the majority of the Afghan people and the precarious position they are in now is more than anything, you need to understand that this has been a horrible catastrophe for the Afghans.
Taliban officials insist that they will fully follow the US deal and prevent any group from using Afghan soil as a base for attacks against the US. and its allies. And the US should not fear that the country will once again become a training ground for terrorism. True or false?
False. The whole myth of the safe haven is what we're talking about here. The whole idea that the Al-Qaeda needed Afghanistan to launch the attacks of 9/11 is just a myth. It's just not how they operate. It's just not how it worked. Yes, the hijackers, and we have to remember that on 9/11, according to the American FBI and the 9/11 Commission report and everything, Al-Qaeda was 400 people total worldwide. Most of them weren't in Afghanistan. Bin Laden and his leadership team were there. I mean, they had sanctuary there, and that's clear. But most of the planning, the preparation, the training for the 9/11 attacks took place outside Afghanistan. Yeah, the Afghan hijackers did go to meet Bin Laden. They did some training there. Some things occurred. But for the most part, 95% of the 9/11 attack planning, training, and preparations took place outside of Afghanistan. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the mastermind of these attacks, did his work from Pakistan, and that's where he was caught. The same as Bin Laden was killed in Pakistan. The leaders of the hijackers were from Germany. They were called the Hamburg Cell, and they did most of their planning and preparation in Hamburg. The man who was the logistics leader, right? The guy who was responsible for all the money, getting the passports, getting these guys enrolled in the flight training academies, all that kind of stuff. He never left Germany until 2 days before the attacks. I mean, and then he went to Pakistan. He didn't go to Afghanistan. I mean, on and on and on. I mean, we have to remember the most important training or safe haven, if you will, for the hijackers were the American flight academies they attended. We had hijackers in this country.
We had them here in San Diego.
Exactly. We had hijackers in this country for 18 months before the attacks took place.
Right.
Planning they had meetings and they met together and planned in Spain and in Malaysia. They as well as there's evidence possibly in Qatar and the UAE as well. So the idea that they somehow needed to be in Afghanistan is just completely false. And it's not held up by the way they act, by the way they operate, by the evidence. Other things too. There were no Afghans involved. They were all Saudis and Yemenis, many of them from Europe. So yeah, there's a lot to this myth that we have to be there or else it's going to happen again. People will say, well, there hasn't been one since that proves it. But, well, yeah, there hadn't been an attack like that before either. They happen to use, they have 400, at most 400 people. My contention is they used their best 5% that day, and they had a great victory. But this certainly wasn't the first attack they had ever launched. It was certainly not the last. In the last 20 years, Al-Qaeda has launched 62 attacks against the United States. Fortunately, they've not been successful as 9/11 was. And fortunately, they've not been as coordinated.
Right. And what's really scary now, Matthew, is that, from 400, they're now in the tens of thousands in multiple countries.
Exactly. Right. I mean, that's the way to look at this, Orly, is like the United States, through its policies, took an organization that was 400 people strong, and it turned into an organization that had tens and tens of thousands of members who, branches, affiliates, offshoots, outfits all around the world. And they have controlled entire regions. They've controlled entire cities at times. They still control parts of Syria. The other way to look at too is that in 2001, the US government said there are 4 international terror groups in Afghanistan, Pakistan. And now the US government says there's 20 international terror groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So how can anyone look at this and say, yeah, we were successful when you've increased the amount of groups that do this stuff by a factor of 5? And, the idea with the 9/11 attacks, just because there hasn't been one of that magnitude, that doesn't prove that the occupation of Afghanistan was successful. It just proved that they haven't had the success in launching an attack like that. And there's no way, again, even if we had at the peak of our presence in Afghanistan, 250,000 men and women, US and NATO soldiers and contractors in Afghanistan. If that had occurred in 2001 or 2000 or 1999, if they were there, it wouldn't have had any effect on this. Bin Laden and his people just would have gone to another country. They would have been, but occupying Afghanistan with a 250,000 man army would have had no effect on this planning and this training and this preparation that took part in Germany, Pakistan, the US, Malaysia, et cetera, that was funded by the Saudis. We know the Saudis were involved quite a bit. There's all kinds of hidden information on that. The US government's keeping, the famous 28 pages of the 9/11 report that was redacted and remains classified that deals with the Saudis' involvement. 20 years later, that's still kept secret from the American public.
Thank you. Since 2001, women have made substantial gains in all spheres. They occupy leadership positions as ministers, members of parliament, judges, prosecutors, and entrepreneurs. Women were represented in the army, police, media, and sports. Also, 8 million children were schooled, including 3 million girls. Under the Taliban, girls were yanked out of school, and nearly all of the schools were either blown up or bullet-ridden. Truth or lie?
Pretty much mostly false. There's a lot of exaggeration. There's a lot of lies about that. The number of school children, yeah, more kids went to school under the American occupation, particularly some girls, but it wasn't the 8 million we're told. That number was a lie. That was a fabricated number. And the Afghan government itself said that. Journalists like Azmat Khan, who did incredible work in Afghanistan, did amazing reporting. And we had what's called the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, a guy named John Sopko. Him and his team since 2012 have been doing just really patriotic work, trying to get some truth and some accounting of what's occurring in Afghanistan. And so, the US government itself says that's not true. Yes, more kids went to school after the Taliban were kicked out, but, it wasn't the success story that's made it to be. You see with the amount of money that was spent on the war, about $150 billion was spent for reconstruction. And according to, the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, about 80% of that $150 billion that we supposedly spent helping to rebuild Afghanistan, about 80% of that, possibly more, made a round trip, as he described it, where that money either never left the United States or it came back to the United States in the pockets of contractors. So much of what we said we were doing over there just didn't happen. The money wasn't spent for them, it was spent for us. The things that were supposedly built, Sopko's people went out and looked for healthcare centers that were supposedly built, and they couldn't find 80% of them. I mean, some of the coordinates that they were given to go find these healthcare centers were coordinates that were in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, so, right, and Azmat Khan, another person, Azmat went out and looked at the schools. And in 2015, she did this, and I really recommend people go and look at her reporting in BuzzFeed in this, where she goes and what she finds is the schools are there, but they're abandoned. They're not being utilized, or they're falling down, or they're not even there. Or, yeah, there are children attending schools, but, the government says 2,000 children are attending this school and only 200 are attending this school. So there's a lot of exaggeration. There was a lot of lying. It was done to support the narrative that the United States is doing good over there. Did some people benefit? Yes. But did most of the Afghans suffer and continue to suffer because of the war? Absolutely.
So you mentioned that despite the advances in the last 2 decades, violence against women is still a problem, with beatings, forced marriage, the lack of economic support. Taliban says they will respect the rights of women and minorities as per Afghan norms and Islamic values. Does that mean domestic violence will stay criminalized and women's rights enshrined in the Afghan constitution?
Well, many times, in Afghan prisons under the Afghan government, the majority of women were in prison not because they were supporting the Taliban, but because they were guilty of committing moral crimes, which again means, like, if you're the one raped or attacked, you're the one who goes to prison, not the rapist or the attacker. I mean, that was the that was the reality of the Afghan government. The warlords who composed the Afghan government were incredibly misogynist. These were the men that brought the burqa to Kabul. The burqa shows up in Kabul as terms of being mandatory for women to wear on the streets in 1994, 2 years before the Taliban take control of Kabul. There is a very conservative, reactionary culture within particularly rural Afghanistan that is misogynist. You would have in areas that the Americans, NATO, the Afghan government controlled, you would never see a woman. I was in Afghanistan for 5 months total, outside of Kabul. Besides the women that worked with us, basically for the American government or some, the women I saw on the streets of Kabul were all wearing burqas, and this was 2009. So the Americans were controlling everything. Things were good. The Taliban weren't as strong as they were now. They certainly weren't launching attacks in the Kabul. But then you got outside of Kabul, and in the 5 months that I was outside of Kabul, in 6 different provinces, I saw a total of 2 women on the street. And they were probably, from what I could gather, something had come up and they had to do something because you just did not see women. I mean, you can talk to American veterans who were over there, and they will tell you that the 9 months, 12 months, however long they spent in Afghanistan, they never saw a woman except for if they surprised them, if they happened to drive into a village and the women were out doing something, and then the women immediately fled and went back inside. I mean, that was the culture that the Taliban came from. The Taliban were more extreme and brutal representation of the culture, but the culture was there, in terms of the way the women were treated, that as soon as a girl begins to become a woman, basically, as soon as she, hits puberty, she is covered and she's kept inside the house. And then she is married off. And again, 4 out of 5 women under the government were forcibly married, which results in the incredible suicide rate of women in Afghanistan. I think most people are familiar with the fact that more men are killed by suicide than women. But in Afghanistan, it's the opposite. 80% of suicide victims in Afghanistan are women. And they do it in government-controlled areas or formerly government-controlled areas. And many of them do it by lighting themselves on fire because their lives are so cruel, so bitter, so oppressive. They've been married off to somebody who is just, who beats them, starves them, oppresses them. What will happen with the Taliban? Could it get worse? Absolutely, it could get worse. Is there a chance for it somehow to get better? Yes, I think, because as long as there was going to be violence, as long as the cycle of violence was continuing, there was no chance for progress. There was no chance for development. There certainly was no chance for stability. And you can't have any advancement as long as that cycle of violence is continuing, as long as people are pushed to the extremes, particularly in a war like Afghanistan, where the Americans pursued a divide and conquer strategy, where the Pashtuns were on the rural Pashtuns were for the most part on the wrong side of that divide and conquer strategy. And when you are pushed into a corner like that, your back is against the wall, where everything is against you, well, who do you turn to? You turn to who's ever available. And in this case, it's the Taliban. It's the more extreme elements. It's the more conservative or reactionary elements. So maybe without those forms of pressure, the pressure of violence, the pressure of a fractured society as a result of an occupation, maybe there is a chance for development, progress, stability that certainly did not exist over these last 20 years.
I hope so. I hope so. More than 3,500 coalition soldiers have died since 2001. About 2/3 of them Americans. May they rest easy, for they all have earned it. More than 20,000 US soldiers have been injured. You are 100% disabled, and you work with veterans and you're close to them. What are they thinking right now, Matthew?
Well, since for as long as there's been polling going back about at least 10 years or so, most veterans of these wars have actually been opposed to these wars, have said that they're not worth fighting or that we should end them, in some variation. so you have seen that, where many of us have come to understand that, these wars were not what we were told they were going to be, that this, our purpose is there. We're not benevolent, that, the purpose is there, as, I came to see it, was for really comes back to domestic American political advantage, right? I mean, Bush being being a wartime president, Obama being a better commander in chief than Bush was, Trump being better than all three. I mean, like, those are I think the calculations that really driven these wars. I think with a lot of veterans, there's a feeling of betrayal. Look, when I was in Iraq in 2006, I just recently came across this. In 2006, in Iraq, almost 80% of American men and women in the military in Iraq believed that they were there because Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. So even 3 years after the American invasion of Iraq, and 5 years after 9/11, 4 out of 5 American soldiers in Iraq are saying we're here because of 9/11. I mean, so they believed it. People believed that, and then when they find out, there's a betrayal, and that betrayal helps lead to a moral injury. It's bad enough you're taking part in immoral things. I mean, war is inherently immoral, and so no matter how moral you think you're going to be in it, you're going to lose out, because the weight of that immorality is going to crush your individual attempts at morality. So, this is why you see throughout warfare, we have records of this going back to the Greeks and the Romans, the psychological consequences of these wars, the moral consequences, the spiritual consequences, and then it's compounded. I hear this even from counterparts, friends, who I hear this from a Vietnamese friend of mine, even among the Vietnamese, within their culture, if you were on the side of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, you view yourself as fighting a war of national liberation. Even though you were in a good war where you have rigged your country after occupation by the French, the Japanese, the French again, and then the Americans, you finally won. They still carry a terrible moral weight with them because of taking part in that killing. So imagine then the weight that comes on Americans who take part in that immorality, who take part in this killing, but then have the additional burden of taking part in wars that were not for the defense of the United States, were not for the benefit of the American people, were not for the benefit of the people that we were occupying, that were based upon lies. And the Afghan war was one big lie. Just as the war in Iraq was, the war in Libya was, the Afghan war was as well. We know this because of the work of men like John Sopko and his people at the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. But we also know that in December 2019, the Washington Post published a huge trove of documents that, formerly classified documents from the U.S. government that, detail through hundreds of interviews, more than 400 interviews with senior American officials, civilian and military, in the Bush, Obama, and Trump administration, that the war was just based on lies. It was a systemic lying from start to finish. So, you have that as well. You have that betrayal. And then I think you get a lot of frustration with the partisan nature of this, with the point scoring. I think a lot of veterans look at what's occurring. They see Trump supporters or Republicans criticizing Biden without saying that Trump or Bush had any blame. The same thing, Biden supporters saying it's Trump or Bush's fault, and like leaving out Biden and Obama, like the contortions that these people go through to pass blame off on the other side, and taking no guilt upon, right? I mean, so I think there's that as well, the partisan point scoring that's occurring. I think that really affects the veterans. And then there's just that whole eternal question of like, what was it worth? Was it just? What did it mean? Maybe you came home okay, but your friends did not. As well as then the whole consequences of the invisible wounds, the traumatic brain injury, the post-traumatic stress disorder, the moral injury, the depression, the substance abuse, on and on, which, come across in so many different ways, and so there's a lot that they're carrying. Yeah.
Right. History, will tell us exactly if it was worth it or not, but it must really hurt right now for a lot of the veterans.
Yeah, I think even those of us who are in the anti-war community who've been working for this for years now or decades now, there's no celebration, there's no gloating. Orly, it's just sadness and anger. That's all that's there. There's sadness and anger because sadness over what happened, sadness over what might still happen, anger over what happened, anger over what might still happen. Yeah.
Matthew, what would you tell young people today wanting to enlist in the military? What would you tell them? What is your
I understand why so many Americans enlist because there are so many Americans who enlist because of economic factors. This is a poverty draft, and the way that the Pentagon and the United States government covers that up is proof that it's a poverty draft. Just to get on a quick, little sidebar, if you ever look at the Pentagon's data on the incomes of their recruits, it's horribly corrupt. What the Pentagon does is like say you go in and you're a recruiter and you sign up to join the Army or the Navy or whatever. The recruiter is going to list your income as your zip code's average income, right? So they're going to assign to every person who's coming in the average income of their zip code, right?
Right.
Which you extrapolate that. And of course, that means that, well, then every recruit, the whole recruiting is going to look like the average of the whole United States. Because for every recruit, you're using the average zip code. I mean, and the excuse is that, well, it'd be too difficult to get the actual income from each recruit, which is a complete lie, because every community college, public university, private college, high school in this country gets that information, right? I mean, so it's by the way that they trying to hide what the actual economic situation of recruits going into the U.S. military proves that this is a poverty draft, right? Because they could very easily get that information. They choose not to, but rather they manufacture it to make it look. So I understand that many young men and women join the U.S. military because this seems like their best option.
There are those that are joining also because they love our country and they want to,
exactly. And this gets back to what I was just talking about with the moral injury, because so many people do join the military expecting to be wearing a white hat because they do want to help. And you saw that. You saw in the evacuation at the Kabul airport, you saw some of the very best of that. You saw young Marines holding babies in their arms, young Marines giving water to Afghan children, lifting babies up over blast walls, right? I mean, you saw this, and you saw the tireless efforts of American air crews and people on the ground to evacuate 120,000 people over the course of 8 or 9 days from one single runway. I mean, the success of that is just absolutely amazing.
Amazing, exactly.
Right? I mean, then you say we bring all these young men and women from around the world, we put them together. They come from all different parts of the country. You're mixing white kids, black kids, Asian kids, Latinx kids. I mean, you're mixing all these kids together, and now it's open. Don't ask, don't tell hasn't been around for a while. So you're mixing straight kids with gay kids. Biden, as much as I'm anti-war, I support the idea of trans people should have the right as everyone else has. So you've got trans people in the military, right? I mean, so you're mixing, and you're teaching them things, and you're giving them responsibility that 20-year-olds probably should not have, in a sense of what they're being asked to do, and they do it. And in the end point of it, Orly, is we send them overseas and we have them kill people. Can you imagine if we did this, right? And we had them doing things to benefit people, just like what we saw can happen in the evacuation from Kabul. I mean, in a sense of there's so much we could be doing right now with the American military if its purpose was not to kill people. Certainly look at what's happened down in Louisiana. Look what's happened in New York. Look what's happened in California with the various climate catastrophes that are unfolding.
All that money went towards climate change.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
All that money, we would have had an amazing, planet right now.
And the
Matthew,
manpower.
I'm sorry, I saw an image of your keychain that says peace is possible, war legalizes murder. So it's obvious you're still fighting for our country, but this time for peace. A peace process is what the Afghan people need and deserve after so many decades of cruel and unimaginable suffering. Moving forward, I think it's important to protect human rights and some of the good achievements of the past 2 decades. This should be a shared responsibility of the United States, the international community, and human rights advocates. Let's call on them. Let's call on them to help maintain that. Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you very much for coming to speak to us and clarifying a lot of things. Stay well and stay safe.
Thank you, Orly.
Thank you. Take care.